Hi everyone, and welcome to ArtsFest Online and to this afternoon's talk with Gabriel Solomons, editor and designer of Beneficial Shock magazine. Gabriel will be giving us an insight into the running and setting up of a magazine from conception to creation to dissemination. Gabriel will also share behind the scenes workings of the magazine itself, so it should prove to be a very, very interesting session. Before we carry on, just a quick reminder that the event is being recorded. It is a public platform, so please, we ask to not share any sensitive information in the chat or the Q&A. So with all that said, welcome everybody, and over to you, Mark.
Yeah, hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mark Austin. I'm the course leader for graphics at Wolverhampton School of Art, and it's my pleasure to introduce Gabriel Solomons to you this afternoon. Gabriel has over 20 years experience in editorial production management, contract publishing and project facilitation for a range of clients, including Sky TV, the V&A, MTV, California Tourism, AllCity Media, HotelMap and Brighton Museum and Galleries. He is both a practicing graphic designer and senior lecturer at Bristol School of Art and Design. And alongside working with clients, he has been responsible for developing a number of trade and academic publications that cover areas of film, design, fandom, and fashion, all of which aim to further our understanding of collaborative practice and explore the wider influence of creativity in society. From 2011 to 2016, he was Innovation Manager and Book Series Editor at Intellect, a UK-based publisher specialising in the fields of creative practice and popular culture. His projects included both editing and art directing the World Film Locations book series that explore the relationship between the city and the cinema, and also Fan Phenomena, a book series that decodes icons of popular culture. Gabriel is chief editor of The Big Picture, an online magazine that explores film in a wider context, and is also the editor and designer of Beneficial Shock, an annual print magazine for film lovers and design enthusiasts that champions progressive thinking from contemporary image makers and writers worldwide. He is currently a member of the education team and judging panel for the International Society of Typographic Designers, and today he joins us remotely here in Wolverhampton. So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce to you Gabriel Solomons. Gabriel, over to you.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks for that introduction. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. I'm hoping there won't be any glitches with the videos or sharing of my PDF. So I'm going to try and put that up now, and then hopefully we can kick off. So I'm going to see if I can do this full screen. We had a little bit of problem before with it. Hopefully we won't this time. So yes. So I think I'm going to have to do it this way rather than full screen. So I've got this horrible little thing up at the top that you might be able to see. These are the joys of doing things online. So yeah, thanks for those of you that have decided to join this talk and attend this talk. I'm going to outline a little bit about my background. I mean, Mark's done a really good job, I guess, of making me sound a lot more professional, and having done loads and loads of stuff. I think when you hear them all in an introduction, it actually sounds quite impressive. When you're actually involved in it and you're doing all those things over a 20-year period, you forget some of that stuff. So it's always quite nice to be reminded of some of those projects that I was involved in. So yeah, today I'm specifically going to talk a little bit about magazine production, because that's, I guess, a running thread that's gone throughout my entire career since graduating from university in 2000. So yes, my name is Gabriel, as you can tell. These are just a few images of some work that I've been involved in, various bits of freelance, working quite early on with digital design and transfer of print material into digital platforms, iPads, PDF, magazines, you know, the early genesis of the ways that magazines and editorial design was starting to shift its way onto technology. But I've always been far more interested in print, as I'm sure lots of you guys are out there as well, and most of the design students that I've worked with, I think there's nothing quite like print. So a little bit, this just gives you a rough overview in a sense of what I've been involved in and my journey since graduation. And the thing about this is it shows the way that editorial design, even though I've done lots of other design work, editorial design is the thing, like I said before, which is the thread that connects, everything that I've done and the things that I most enjoy up until my most recent magazine, Beneficial Shock. So I graduated in 2000, was the communications officer at the university. So that was my first, I guess, job out of uni, but I wanted to get more experience in understanding how you would run a magazine, but also financially what's involved in running a magazine and working with various teams. So it gave me the opportunity, while not quite in the professional world, but working for the university, and they had two magazines that we had to produce and a newspaper. So by doing that and becoming a communications officer, which I would always recommend or suggest to students that feel that they want to get into this area, but without necessarily the big risks of going out to the professional world, is through the university structure. I was able to work on magazines, and I had a budget, and I had to understand how that budget worked. I would be working with printers, I'd be working with teams of writers, illustrators, photographers. So that was my first step into this world of editorial design. So that was for a year. And I produced, like I said, a few of those magazines. And from there, that was really useful for me because I was able to put that into my CV and apply for various jobs. And I won a competition, which at that stage, I think it still happens now, where you can enter your publications for The Guardian and The Independent at the time were doing competitions for Best Student Magazine and Best Student Designed Magazine and newspaper. So I submitted for that and I won that. And the prize was to work for a while at The Independent in London and to work on the Saturday magazine that they were producing down there. So I managed to do that for about 2 or 3 weeks. And that led on to me doing a bit more work for them. So after that, and working for a daily newspaper, which was quite hard work, very high stress, very high pressure, and even the magazine that was coming out once a week, I didn't quite enjoy the process of working to such a tight deadline. I preferred the idea of monthly magazines or bi-monthly magazines. So I left that job and I set up my own publishing company because I was interested in designing and producing a arts magazine for Bristol and Bath, which is what I did. And that took me into the world of freelance. So again, with the experience that I'd built by being the comms officer and working at The Independent, I had a pretty good idea of how to work with teams, how to manage budgets, and all those things that I think are pretty necessary when you want to go into the world of editorial publishing. But it's a lot of hard work, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on, and preparation is a real key for this. So I worked as a freelance publisher for about 5 or 6 years. And while I was doing that, I took on various jobs for different magazines. There was a magazine in Sweden that I ended up redesigning. And that was a film magazine, which was my first foray into doing things around film in editorial publishing, which started to fuse my interests, my various interests of design and then film, because I've loved film ever since I was a kid. And on top of that, I was taking on about 3 or 4 other publications and magazines. Another one of them was a film magazine for this publisher Intellect that was based in Bristol. And that was a monthly magazine that was freely distributed into independent cinemas all over the country and also to film festivals in pretty much around Europe. And what I really liked about that is that I was working for a publisher that had the budget. I could manage that budget. There was no real pressure around advertising. We could send it out for free because we had certain sponsors that were enabling us to do that. And that, again, was another step towards understanding how I could work with distribution models, which was slightly different than the bog standard ones where you could get magazines into things like W.H. Smith's at the time, which was pretty much where most magazines were going about 20 years ago. So from that, I was working more as a freelancer, and I decided to set up a new magazine about 3-4 years ago with a partner of mine called Phil Rigglesworth. And alongside doing all of my work, I also lecture at the University of the West of England with graphic design students. So at the time, I was really interested in looking at independent publishing models and the way that a lot of new magazines were being produced, but that there was a distribution model to support those. So that's in a way what prompted me to set up another magazine. So yeah, the whole thing about independent magazines is they're a massive growth sector. I think everyone who's perhaps been into an independent magazine shop can actually see the amount of mags that are out there, and they change all the time because I would say there's a fairly fast turnover in terms of how many are produced and how many actually survive. And that's one of the big parts of this talk, is to hopefully for you guys to understand a little bit about what's the sustainable model when you get into producing a magazine. If you are interested in doing anything like this, is thinking about not just the first issue, but thinking about what it is that you're trying to achieve in the long term. Because having those thoughts in mind when you set up your own magazine really helps, and means that you're not just doing things for 2 or 3 months. You're really thinking about how you can sustain a project that you're producing. So there's lots of these organizations around and champions for independent publishing, which wasn't really the case when I first got into magazines about 20 years ago. You have exhibitions, you have things like Stack, which is this independent magazine subscription service where you can sign up to it and you receive a different indie mag every month, which has been going probably for about 8 or 9 years now. The Flat Plan and things that are organized by Mag Culture in London with Jeremy Leslie, that is one of these champions of magazines, and he's been doing this for years and years and years. But the internet and social media and having a physical shop and setting up conferences again starts to proliferate the community and the support that this community has. And also things like Monocle, which is a very upmarket publication that's produced, I think, monthly or bi-monthly, but they have this thing called the Stack, where they invite people to talk about designing or editing large-scale magazines, but also they invite quite a few indie mag producers on there. So there's lots of stuff out there to help get the word out and to feel that this is an industry that's being supported really well. So the reasons that I feel that magazines are such a growth sector, and there's so many people that are interested in getting involved, is that one of the reasons I think is this freedom to play with the form. So when you're doing an independent magazine, if you understand budgets and you start to speak to printers, and your mindset is from a design mindset, is you can really have a lot of fun with it. I mean, there's magazines that are tiny, the size of a passport, and there's magazines that are huge in scale. There's magazines that play around with different paper stocks. There's interactive publications. So that freedom to play with the form, I think, is one of those reasons that really so many people are interested in getting involved. I think the diverse subject matter, which caters to specific audiences, I think is also a big appeal, because it's not, you can be producing a magazine for a really small niche group of people that share your interests. It can be, female drummers, or it can be skateboarders, or it can be, surfers, or it can be people interested in the occult, or it can be people that are interested in a specific subgenre of film. So the ability to be able to do publications, but to cater them to very specific small audiences, I think is another big appeal. They're often driven by passion and not necessarily profit. So they are passion projects for lots of people, and designers and editors and writers who are doing this alongside other careers and other jobs. It's not necessarily that they're doing it as the sole reason for them to make money. It's, the magazines now are able to reach audiences around the world, thanks to, technology and again, social media. And also with things like Patreon and Kickstarter, Twitter and Instagram, it's a lot easier now to build an audience and to cater to that audience and to feel that that audience has got some interplay with what you're doing and they feel a vested interest in what you're doing, as small or as large as that audience might be. And also the ability now to sell directly to them. So you don't necessarily have to rely on getting your magazine into magazine shops. So yeah, the great thing for makers at the moment is the proliferation of shops and online stores dedicated to selling and celebrating independent magazines, which again, in my experience, wasn't the case 20 or even 10 years ago. So there's a lot more there to support the distribution, the sales, and effectively shouting about the project that you're interested in doing. So, and I think this community building is massively important. So there's lots of like-minded people that love print and they want to see it succeed. So this community is generous. And if you can connect with it, and, me being involved in Beneficial Shock now, realizing that there's lots of people that are doing it and we're all in this thing together. The makers, the sellers, the distributors, the buyers. So it helps everyone to rise up. And I think because a lot of these independent mag stores, they want to succeed, but them succeeding relies on the fact of magazines being out there and them doing well. So they, again, have got a vested interest, but they also love the magazines, which was not always the case when magazines that I was producing very early on were going out into something like WH Smith's or into supermarkets or airports. There was no one really there to shout about it. But if you go into an indie mag store in the same way that you go into an indie bookstore, they're passionate about it. So they'll have those little tags that say, oh, check this out if you're interested in this, that, and the other. So everyone's part of that bigger community. Now, this isn't necessarily thinking that you out there, the people that are listening to this talk, are interested in publishing a magazine, but if you are, hopefully there's some things in this talk that will be helpful to you to consider. Just showing this image, this was a great magazine, a book about magazines by Angharad Lewis that came out about 5 or 6 years ago. So you want to publish a magazine, which was great. I mean, I'd read plenty of magazines and books about magazines. I'd interviewed people about it before I set up my own one to get a better sense of it. But this book, if you want to add to your, design resources shelf, which I always encourage my students to do, is, invest 10, 15 quid in a book that you can dip in and out of, which is not the same as having a website or web links. This is a really good book because there's great interviews and there's great sections breaking down the people that you need to look at and the sort of things that you need to consider. And it was really good to see a book like that come out, which was very accessible and very easy to manage, and gave you that sense that if you wanted to go into independent publishing, there was a great resource out there for you. So I'm breaking down this talk into 3 different sections. The first section is conception, so thinking about starting out, when you've got an idea about a potential magazine or book for that case. So the questions, there's a series of questions throughout this talk, and I think they're really, really important because, as I said before, preparation is the key. So the first question I asked myself was, why am I doing this? And the second one was, what do I want to achieve? Because the why and the what of magazines is so key, because they're the things that will help to drive you along as you continue the journey. Because it's quite easy to be despondent. It's quite easy to lose heart when things aren't going necessarily the way that you want, or if you're not selling as many, or you're having difficulties with, getting, content in, or thinking about where you're going to get money from. But having these 2 questions and thinking about those before you do anything is really, really vital. So when I was thinking about some of these questions, I was thinking, well, for me to set up a magazine, Beneficial Shock at the time, is I wanted it to complement mine and Phil's work as educators. So it was really important that the magazine was a reflection of some of the things that I was doing and I was talking to students about in terms of editorial design, in terms of pitching your ideas, in terms of art direction, in terms of working with illustrators, photographers, designers, whatever it might be. I was really keen on building a community of writers and illustrators that shared our beliefs. So this was about community building. Because I wanted to get a little bit further into this area and engage a little bit more with professional illustrators. And the third thing is that I wanted to create something beautiful and unique, which was linked again to Phil and I's passions, his passion of illustration, my passion of film and design. So the next set of questions we asked was, do we have a unique idea? And is there an audience for it? And thirdly, what is its purpose? Because I think, again, you can produce something, you can have an idea of something, but it might be so limited that it's primarily about your own interest. But you've got to think to yourself, even if you've got a small, area of interest that you're working in, ultimately you want this thing to succeed in one way or another. So you've got to think about that audience. So when we were thinking about our publication, it's really important to think that there's so many magazines out there that it's really important when you're looking at a magazine, and I'm a fan of so many magazines out there, but there's various things that appeal to me about each one of those magazines. And if you go into those magazines and if you go onto their websites, you'll usually see a mission statement. You'll get a sense for what they do, but you'll get a sense for why they're doing it. What is their purpose? For example, something like the Gourmand, which is a food magazine, but it's highly designed, it's beautifully produced, is about the world of food. It's not just about making it, but it's about the culture of food, and presenting it in such a way that was really creatively engaging. Gal Dem is, for females of lots of different, races and creeds, but about, women becoming more empowered and being able to take the lead in all the various things that they're doing in their careers, creatively mainly. And something like the magazine Fucked, which has been around for years and years, was the idea of experimenting with the form of a publication, a magazine. So every time you saw a copy of their magazine, which was predominantly creative with artists and writers, but they would take that and just play with the structure and the form. So when you picked it up, you knew the manifesto, the philosophy of this publication was really to just explore and not take things for granted in terms of what a magazine could or should look like. So from our perspective, we wanted, the manifesto of our publication, we wanted it to be entirely illustrated film magazine, which was going to be unlike anything else out there. So we were really trying to push the boat out and say, okay, if we're doing this, we don't want it to look like anything that might resemble Beneficial Shock. We knew that there was a few things closely aligned to it, but we said, okay, well, if we're going to create this and we're putting a lot of time and effort and energy into it and money, what is it that we're going to do that we're going to get some benefit and some experience from and satisfaction from? So we also wanted illustrators and other creatives. We knew that this was going to be a source of visual inspiration. And we also thought that if we're targeting this to film lovers, we wanted this magazine to have to sort of bridge that divide between people that were looking at magazine, but they were also looking at how a magazine could engage with people around film, but not in the conventional way. So there was something that was looking more at the imagination around film. And we also wanted to challenge traditional art direction. So rather than just the simple methods of someone sending a piece of writing to an illustrator or a photographer and then 2 or 3 days later getting that back, we were more interested in the idea of how we could work with creatives in a collaborative sense over longer periods of time. So the next set of questions we had was how much time and or money did we have to invest in this? And were we prepared to do all of the unglamorous jobs? And this is where this kind of idea of honesty comes in, that you have to be honest with yourself, because there is going to be a lot of times that when you're working on something like this, on a project that's your passion, and doesn't necessarily have a lot of money, you don't have a lot of people involved in it and a massive team that you can rely on, it might be just one or two people involved in it, you're going to have to do a lot of that stuff. So are you prepared to do it? Because when you're setting up an indie mag, you've got to handle finances, you've got to handle the admin of emailing and chasing people up. And if you're working with distribution, you've got to manage that process as well. So time management and being able to organize your time is really, really important. So in response to those questions, yes, we had time set aside as part of our jobs. And we will need investment capital in order to launch. We understood that for the ambitions that we had for our magazine, that we just didn't want to produce it as a simple black and white publication or something that was just done on bog standard paper. We wanted to really put a lot of time and energy and love into it. So when people picked it up, it was something that they felt was something they wanted to hold on to and keep. And yes, we were prepared to do all the unglamorous jobs, but we needed to do a lot of research on some of these to prepare ourselves accordingly. So what is beneficial shock? For those of you that maybe haven't seen it or haven't gone to the website, this is what it looks like. We're now on issue 6, and issue 6 was released about 5 months ago, and we're now working on issue 7. So that will be released towards the end of September, early November. Now, the starting point of the whole concept behind beneficial shock is that I've always been inspired by this quote by Martin Scorsese, which is, cinema is a matter of what's in the frame and what's out. And this links again to this idea of the imagination, that we all go to movies, but when we come away from them and we're away from the imagery, the way that we might describe it or explain it to someone else is that we have different visuals and different images in our mind of what those films can be. So it really sparks off our imagination, but it also exists outside of that framework, because when we talk about the story that we've seen in the film, we basically continue the film. It might finish after an hour and a half or 2 hours, but we're the ones that fill in some of those blanks and interpret things in different ways. So I really liked his explanation of that. And we were also inspired visually, as well as conceptually, by Werner Herzog, who's a really conceptual, but he's an out there filmmaker. He's made loads of films, but they've got a real personal voice to them. He loves taking risks. He's not really about just doing the bog standard sort of storyline of a Hollywood film. If anything, he's the anathema to that. He's the antithesis with the way that he works on films, but also the subject matter of his films are things that work on the edge of society. He's really interested in characters that are pushed to the edge or they're on the fringes of society, the outliers. And that, again, was before we did anything. We were just thinking about the people that inspired us. So it's a fully illustrated movie magazine with sharp teeth, and that's what we first had as our byline. And that was helping us to describe, again, the philosophy, the intention of the publication itself. But if we expanded that mission statement, it was that magazine, but it also aims to challenge the traditional role of visual creative from a content servicer to that of an author, researcher, and content driver. So again, what we wanted is that everyone involved in the publication was working together with us with a driven mission to really push what we were doing in terms of storytelling through the visuals, not just the writing. Again, you might know this man. We've always been, I think, when we look at film and we think about the films that have inspired us, both Phil and I, there's this idea that filmmaking is a fairly standard set direction, by individual directors. And Alfred Hitchcock himself was the inspiration for the name Beneficial Shock, because he said that all films should entertain, but they should be of a beneficial shock. So you might be on the edge of your seat, you might be scared, you might be, enthralled, whatever it is. And because he dealt predominantly with crime and thrillers and things that were edge of your seat type stuff, he wanted you to come away from the film feeling like, you know, you'd been sort of woken up in some way. So it needed to be shocking, but it was also good for you in a way. So the name, inspired by him, is that we didn't want to pretend to be polite, but we also don't want to lazily offend. So although we had this kind of idea of shock, it's not that everything that we have in there is primarily there to shock people, but we wanted to work with illustrators and writers that had a little bit of an edge to what they did, rather than, you know, a lot of the popular stuff that might be out there. So with all those questions in mind, the preparation that you have when you're putting together something, you know, any type of independent publication, it's really important to be clear about what you are. So we took all those questions, we then wrote a synopsis, outlining that in about 8 or 9 points in terms of what our intention was. What was this thing that we were creating? It's almost creating a personality for the publication, in the same way as that, you know, when you talk about typefaces, there's no coincidence that they're called faces, because in a way they've got character. Even the word character, there's so many things within typography that talks about the idea of a personality or an identity. And it's no different with magazines. Obviously it needs to stretch itself and open itself a little bit out, but the clearer you are with this type of stuff, the more it aligns your magazine to audience. So you have a clear idea of what you're doing and who you're doing it for. And those people, when they pick it up, they don't need to read through synopsises and keywords and all that sort of stuff, because that's the stuff that goes into the background. But if you've done all this preparation prior to getting the magazine out there, you have a really clear idea of what your identity is. Because all magazines and books, they go into sections, they go into specific areas, they go into things that, you know, people can then categorize what it is that you do. And the easier you are to be categorized, in a sense, the better it is for distributors, the better it is for readers. So that's where things like a synopsis will lead on to things like keywords, you know, putting things together like reader profiles, and also having, in a sense, an idea of what your tone of voice is. Because all magazines, when you pick them up, some of them can be very serious, some can be humorous, some can be, you know, conceptual. So by having a tone of voice and understanding what kind of publication it is that you're doing, that's the stuff that you always have in the back of your mind. So whatever you're doing, issue by issue, you keep on coming back to the idea of, okay, are we still retaining the same identity? Because that's the thing, after 4 or 5 issues, that people start to note you for and identify you for, and be able to set you apart from the rest of other magazines out there, because you have this identity. So the second part is creation. So once you've done all that research and you've identified what it is that you're doing, who it's for, you know, the preparation time that you've got, and, you know, identifying how much time you've got to devote to these projects, you now have to start thinking about creating this thing. So again, questions that you have to start with in a way before you get cracking is thinking about how many copies you want to print, because again, this is dependent on finances and how much you might or might not have. So how often will the magazine be published? Are you going to have advertising or not? Because each one of those things is dependent on extra time and extra sort of work that you need to do. How will it be distributed? And what's the cover price? So going through these things one by one, this is looking at beneficial shock. So this is the answers that we had, or the way that we filled in these questions for ourselves. So copies, we had an initial run of 1,000. Now with most indie magazines, 500 to 1,000 is pretty bog standard. There are a lot of independent magazines out there that grow to 10, 15, 20,000. They start to become less independent because they take on a different infrastructure. But most independent magazines run from about 500 to 1,000 when they first set up. And in a way, I think when you're doing this, you might have aspirations, grand aspirations, that everything's going to go hunky-dory and you're going to be a massive success. But there's nothing worse, and I've had this experience before, unfortunately, than having piles of magazines unsold at home, in boxes, in your bedroom, in the garage, wherever it might be, or at the distributor. That effectively, if you do have a distributor, they might pulp those. So it's a waste of money. Advertising, we don't have any advertising. We didn't want advertising because, again, based on the time that we had available to do this, keeping in mind that we had jobs that we were running alongside the things that we're doing. Selling advertising is massively time consuming, and you need to print and distribute a lot more to reassure advertisers, because 500 to 1,000, if you're getting it into indie shops and you're not guaranteed that you're going to sell every one of those things, there's not many advertisers going to say, great, I'm going to jump on top of that, because they're going to go to something that might have 10,000. And then you need to have the ABCs. You need to be able to show them and prove to them that these magazines are selling a specific amount every issue. How often did the magazine come out? We decided on a biannual structure. So this allowed us time for the creation of each issue while we were balancing out our full-time jobs or our 0.8, 0.9 jobs. The revenue for things like that is more infrequent. And this is why it's really important to consider the nature of the content. So with us, although we're doing a film magazine, the content that we've got in there, because we're biannual, and now we've converted to an annual, it's not stuff that's coming out this month. We're a magazine that predominantly looks at cinema across the last 100 years, effectively. So as long as it's a film or something that we feel is worth checking out, that's the starting point. But the issues that we deal with and the subject matter that we deal with is universal. So it's not really timed to a specific time frame in the way that something like, let's say, Empire magazine, which comes out monthly, or even Little White Lies, which comes out every 2 months, can have review sections. We don't have anything like that in our magazine. So the justification for our frequency is exactly that. So we don't have this release schedule. But what we are doing now is we're using the website a little bit more to do interviews with creatives, with illustrators, with film poster designers, and we might start to dabble with the idea of current reviews, but it's really not what we do. So it's probably something that, unless we're reviewing something that might have come from Criterion Collection and there was a fantastic illustrator that did the cover art or something, that might be merit for us to do some kind of review, but it would be probably less about the film. It would be more about the artist or the illustrator. So the distribution, when we started off, it was DIY. So we did it ourselves because we wanted to understand it a little bit more, because the last time I had done a magazine that was sold was a long time ago. So the models of distribution had changed a lot. So we wanted to get in contact with smaller independent magazine shops, first of all, because we could negotiate better costs with them than going through a distributor. But it required a huge amount of time to process orders. We had to chase invoices. We had to handle the delivery ourselves. So we had to take it to post offices. We had to do all of that stuff. We kept more of the revenue, but what we realized after the first 2 issues is it was just too much time that it was taking up, and it was better for us to go with a distributor in the end, which we are doing now. The price point, average. I mean, now you'll see magazines for £25, which is sort of the price of a really nice design book. I'm not sure if those magazines merit that cost, but people buy them. Our price point was £10. So, it's really important to calculate that. And it's based on lots of different aspects. So when you're calculating it, you're thinking about things like the print and the paper stock. You're thinking about the editorial budget. So if you're actually paying people to write or design or to proofread, and you're paying for illustrators or photographers, the postage and the fulfillment, which is a big part of that. So if we're doing it ourselves, it does cost a lot of money to do that postage. And the delivery, and also paying distributors and wholesalers. If you've got any staff that you're working with, you've got to think about the staff wages and the overheads and the bills in the office. Even if it's a small individual office that you've got, you still have to factor that in. And we did all of that stuff, and we realized, okay, £10 is pretty much the right price point for us. So other questions you need to think about is what's the size of the magazine, and how many pages, and how will it be bound? Because again, these are the specifics of printing that, again, will depend on how much you probably need to charge for it. And also when you're thinking about posting it, because the size of a magazine, there's a lot of people out there that produce smaller magazines because it's far more cost effective to post them. And they might be doing 64 pages instead of 82 pages or 96 pages, because again, the weight of it based on the weight of the paper will mean that they're not outstripping their profits by spending so much money on the the delivery costs. So all of those things again are factored in that you need to think about. If it's a physical publication that you're working in, it makes a big difference to your expenses. So a lot of those things that we looked at the costing, we understood the costings and how much it was going to cost us. Then we had to start thinking about, okay, well, where are we going to get our funding from for Beneficial Shock? And we realized I had never done a Kickstarter before. Again, when I'd done publications in the past, they were either sponsored or I worked with advertisers, but I'd never done Kickstarter, and I was interested to see how the model worked. So we decided that's what we were going to do, because it also enabled us to build a community. And I think that's one of the best things about things like Kickstarter, is that you can engage people straight away with your potential readership, and you can see them, because outside of your parents and your friends and people that might throw you some money initially, once you get onto Kickstarter, and if you do a good Kickstarter video and campaign, that can actually really help you to not just in the instant getting the money for the project that you want to do in that 30 days, but also use that audience to send newsletters to, and to be effectively the basis of your future market, as it were. So what we did prior to that is that I printed about 10 copies of the first issue. We realized that if we're going to do a Kickstarter, we don't want to put something on Kickstarter that tells people what we're going to do. We wanted to have something on Kickstarter that showed us what we are doing. And it was a reality in people's minds. So they had, faith, and they had confidence in what we were doing, that they wanted to actually have a copy of this thing out there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to stop sharing this for a minute. And I'm going to share, just to show you a little bit of the Kickstarter that we did, to give you an idea of what we produced. So hopefully the sound will work on this.
When we talk about film, we are talking about every aspect of our lives. At its best, film is innovative and surprising. It can challenge the way we think or see the world. Plot details? Stars? Stars? We're interested in the thing that keeps the conversation flowing in the pub after the film. The scenes that stick with you. The images that haunt your dreams. Sometimes it's hard to pin down what it is exactly, and even harder to put into words. Film is a visual medium. So why are the visuals in film magazines, the illustration, design and photography, invariably treated as they would be in any other magazine? As a side note, a decorative accompaniment, we want to change that. To treat illustration and design as an equal player in the editorial process. We think a magazine that talks about films should be as much about the visual as the written. As close to the experience of film and cinema as possible. Introducing Beneficial Shock. A new kind of film magazine. One that approaches film in the context of a wider culture. Both a reaction to the art form and an art form to be reacted to itself.
But what's it all about?
Beneficial Shock.
So yeah, that just gives you a sense of what we aim to do with the Kickstarter, and it really made a difference, because I think what we wanted the Kickstarter film to be, and we recruited 3 of our illustrators to work with us on it. We wrote a script, which again was based on that early research that we did, a synopsis, writing what is it that we're trying to achieve, what is it that sets us apart, what's our ambition for the project. And because we had all of that stuff, we could write a script, we could almost make a film. And that's what we wanted to show people, is that because we're a film magazine, by actually making a film that gave people a visual look at what our manifesto was, and kind of showed them the those keywords that we were looking at. We wanted it to be humorous, we wanted it to be colorful and irreverent and a little bit out there and quite unconventional. And that's what the film was. So people could look at the pages that we produced for the magazine, but they could also look at the film and say, okay, now we've got that philosophy. And it was great fun to produce. But you could see even in that Kickstarter, there was people holding up the magazine, and we gave the illustrators a few of the copies, and we asked them to kind of send them to friends that lived in different parts of the world and then send it back to them and take photographs. So all of that stuff kind of enabled us to produce something that, you know, gave people the confidence to say, okay, this isn't just a run of the mill. This isn't just something about a hopeful project that they're doing. This has got real worth to it. And it you know, enabled us to get that financing that we needed. So when we're thinking about the publication itself, and this is really important when you're doing a magazine, is thinking about the production of wireframes, you know, taking the proposals that you've got and the content that you're looking at and thinking about how you start to plan and plot out your publication. And the design aspect is always, for me, the end of the entire process. Because once you've got an idea of what the content, especially when you're thinking about, you know, content generation for magazines, is having this type of stuff just gives you the overview. And this will happen in any magazine or newspaper out there, that you'll see that people create these thumbnails and wireframes that just effectively has the content in there to understand how the pacing of content works throughout the magazine. So when we're commissioning work for Beneficial Shock, we have three different ways that we're doing that. But at the root of them all is this commitment to, you know, informed research and long-term collaboration with them. Because a lot of people that we worked with in the first issue are still working with us now, about 5 or 6 issues later. So the people we work with, we feel that we want to be part of this bigger Beneficial Shock team. So the first commissioning process that we have is this traditional model where the illustrator is given the written content to respond. So you'll see this in pretty much every magazine or newspaper that you look out there, is that there's an article, that article gets written, it's 800 words, 1,000 words, 2,000, whatever, gets sent out to the illustrators, and our illustrators will respond to that with doing a series of, you know, 4, 5, 6 different illustrations for it. Again, you know, working with the type of illustrators that we do, most of them are professionals, but we do have this sliding scale where we like to introduce new illustrators, because we get a lot of emails from students or people that have just graduated looking to get into editorial design. But because we only produce 1 issue now a year, and we've got 96 pages to fill, it's quite a competitive area. So, you know, unless someone really stands out with the work that they're doing, but we always look to pair those illustrators in a way with content that they're interested in or that they've done work around. So even though it's around film, but for example, on the left, we've got Joe's work there, but he'd done a lot of work around gangster films and gangs in films and communities and small crime families. So he was perfectly suited to do an article when we were looking at this guns, gangs, and families at war. And, you know, that's part of this process of commissioning. It's not just looking at someone that does great looking illustrations. It's thinking about their relevance to the content that we're working with. So the second commissioning process we've got is the illustrator gets commissioned in the same way as a writer would, where it's directed towards a subject area, and they take on the role of a researcher and content developer. So they become the piece's author. So conventionally, the way that you see a lot of that is with comics. So we have about 5 or 6 different comics in every issue. But what we tend to do is that the comic writer had pitched us ideas in the first issue, and if they were really, really good, we made those a feature. So Jakob's work there on the left, he's been doing this Hollywood self-help series for us since issue 2, because it was so good and what he produced was great, but he took full ownership over that. He knew the themes that we were working with, but he came up with this idea of the Hollywood self-help, which is effectively, you know, Hollywood stars on the couch, you know, the casting couch, or, you know, going to different situations where they were getting advice or they were in therapy. And each one of them connects really well to every theme that we have, but we leave it to Jakob. So he's effectively the author of that work. And the example on the right with Harry's work is that with the last theme that we had, Courage and Strength, he pitched us this idea of 1980s, macho, movie stars. So people like Sylvester Stallone and Jean-Claude Van Damme and, Arnold Schwarzenegger. And he wanted to do them as like a set of these cards, these movie meatheads. So again, he took the ownership over the work. He knew what the theme was, and he just pitched us the idea. And although I design around it and I create a little bit more of the designs around the work that gets submitted, I work with them to think more about how they can present that work in the way of their illustrations. So although Harry did the illustrations, I suggested to him to kind of do these cards that he could, that as you went through the 4 or 5 pages, you could see these cards slightly being shuffled. So we worked together again around their ideas. And these are just some more examples where you've got the illustrator, and that's Phil's work on the right, who actually wrote and illustrated his own piece. So again, he's becoming the author, but it's very, very rare that you'll find in any other magazine or newspaper where a writer will also be doing the illustrations for their piece. And that's what we sort of want to encourage a little bit more of. So people do have a little bit more of that authorship and a vested interest in the work that they produce. This is, again, because we have a lot of focus on typography and physical 3-dimensional type in the magazine. So we have a series every issue of quotes linked to the theme. And this is the work by Susie Eland, who is actually one of my old students or ex-students from about 7 or 8 years ago. And she ended up getting into fabricated physical typography. And she's been doing a lot of this work over the last 5 years. And again, what we do is we work with a photographer. She creates the piece. We talk in discussion with her about what the idea that she might want to do. She goes away, she creates all of these things in 3D. Then we work with a photographer and we create almost a stage set for these things to be photographed. And then they go into the magazine. But these pieces also were turned into moving images. So the way that the blood is dripping on the one on the left from Carrie, and the way that I'm Spartacus with the typers floating around, we turn these things almost into moving GIFs as well, which again brings back the whole idea that we are a movie magazine, so we want to have things in motion. This again is sculptural stuff where illustrators, take on the role of these authors. So the content on the right, which was about the casting couch and the way that can actually be quite, a negative aspect of Hollywood and the reputation is, especially with, Harvey Weinstein and stuff like that, and working back to the idea of how these things get linked into crime of some way. So Katya basically took that as a theme, wrote the pieces, and then created these small little sculptural pieces. And again, she's been working in sculpture and 3D illustration for about 10 years now. We had these as well, which again turned into animated pieces. And these were things that we used in the first issue, because the first issue was the food issue. And these worked as motion pieces that were like teasers for the issue itself. So the third way that we commission illustrators is the illustrator works really like a writer. So they produce the artwork first, and then they hand it to a writer who responds to the image. So it's the reverse process where usually it's the writer sending it and then an illustrator coming along. This is totally the opposite direction. So this is this is from the last issue, and we had Mr. Doodle, who was an ex-student of Phil's, and he does all this doodling stuff, and he's quite well known on social media, and he's selling his work all over the world. But again, because we had a contact through him, and he was a student of Phil's from, I think, 7 or 8 years ago, he was able to come on board, do a piece for us, which he was inspired by, but he didn't want to write any of the text. He just wanted to produce this piece, which was effectively a triptych of the Matrix films, done as one complete doodle. So you have to look into it. It was like almost like a Where's Wally type thing. And then we wrote the text for that. And similarly on the right with Ian's pieces, that he he had done something about 2 years ago. He'd done a magazine or a publication himself about hotel reviews, crap hotel reviews from various websites. And he printed and published that himself. And he approached us and he said he wanted to do something about these egos, these massive Hollywood egos that come up with sayings and quotes that are just absolutely ridiculous. So he came up with the illustrations, sent it to us, and then we started to write the pieces around his illustrated ideas. This is just a really simple outline just to show, if anyone's interested in from the design context of the magazine, it shows you the simple grid structure for how Beneficial Shock works. And I haven't really changed this grid ever since the magazine was produced, for the first issue. So I've kept to things pretty rigorously. And I think it's important when you're doing a magazine, a publication, it doesn't matter if it comes out every 6 months or every year, whatever it is. I think it's really important to have consistency, because once you come up with a visual idea, which in a way needs to be connected to your content or your theme, it shouldn't be like the design looks totally different to the sort of content or the tone of voice that you've got. And I think that's a discipline to be able to marry those two different things out. But this very simple structure that I have just lends a lot of flexibility to be able to put in the content there. And I didn't want an overly complex design for the magazine, because it's full of such different illustration, and it's a riot of color and a riot of sound in a way, because illustration can be very much like a sound, because it sort of hits in the way that it comes across. So I wanted something to be quite simple, a modular grid system that would allow for some flexibility, but was also had a little bit more of a restraint to allow that illustration to do its work. So the third part, when you're producing magazines or you're creating a magazine, is to get it out there. And the distribution actually is sometimes the most difficult part of magazines, because the rest of it you've got some sort of control over. Distribution is harder because you're sending it out there and you're never sure whether people are going to pick this up or not. So we've got 3 ways of distributing Beneficial Shock. We've got a distribution company, so we use Central Books. We also do direct distribution with various people, and the most recent of those is Wormhole in Singapore, that set up as an indie mag store about 6 months ago. And they approached us and we wanted to do something directly with them, because getting magazines out to Asia is really, really difficult. And our distribution company, Central, doesn't work with them. So we were able to do things a little bit more independently. And also we sell through our website, which again, during COVID has been a lifesaver. So the distribution company, by using them, we've got the freedom to create, we've got wider visibility because they do all the work for us. It helps to increase our circulation, but it's more expensive. So we get paid last in the process, and I'll show you how that works in a minute. And we also lose unsold copies unless we pay for them to come back or we hold on to those copies. Direct distribution, the positives of that is that we can strike deals with them individually. We have a direct relationship with these people, so we don't have to go through a middle person. We can target regions because we've realized that Beneficial Shock does really well in Asia, so we're starting to do more of that. But it is time consuming and it takes longer to get any sort of results from that. The DIY process of selling things through our website is it's cheaper, we can control the entire process, and we get paid effectively immediately. But again, it's time consuming and we have to handle fulfillment, which we have to do through postage. Just to give you a very quick overview of this idea of the distribution process and how and why a lot of magazines get killed off after the first issue or after the second issue. Because you have to realize that when you go through a distribution company, you won't get paid until everything comes back and all the unsolds come back. And then you've got a 2 or 3 month wait process even after that to actually get your money. So if you look at it from the principle of how we started out with our second issue when we were distributing through Central Books, is we got the magazine out to them on January 15th. So 2 weeks later, the outlets are sent the magazines by the distributor. Now we're looking at 6 months later, the outlets, because we were working on a biannual cycle, is the outlets return the unsold copies. So they send those back to the distributor, and that gives them a sense of how many have been sold. August 1st, so we're going into the tail end of the year now, distributor issues a purchase order for the sales to us. We can get that back, and so we invoice the distributor for the magazine sold, and then you can see by November we're paid by the distributor. So it's almost a year before you get any money. So if you're relying on that money to produce your second issue, because what we were doing is that we were working on the next issue by before the summer, because if we want to get that magazine out, it's that following 6 months, so it's going to be in the middle of the year. And if we're relying on that money to pay for the next print run, we're kind of screwed. So this is where it's really, really important to understand these cycles of how money will be received by you if you're going through the conventional distribution models. And this is why a lot of people control it themselves or try to sell directly through websites until they're in a position where the money is cyclical and you can have 2 or 3 things going at once, so you can get some money in, so you're not wholly reliant on the distribution money coming in if you're working on a biannual or even an annual, which will take probably 18 months for you to get paid for the previous issue. So we always say, and I've said this over the last few years, and this is what we take to heart ourselves, is that we need to sell as many copies as we can ourselves, because we'll get pretty much most of that money. So on our website, we use Shopify. So our website is effectively built using Shopify. So it's a sales website. So we've got fulfillment, we've got control all over the entire process. We can get the magazines out there. We are embedding a distribution and a print delivery service, which means that it's all factored into the costs. So when we've got on the website delivery costs, we factor that in, and then we can print off the labels, which goes through a service called Hermes, and we can see exactly how much money we've got left over. So we can add or subtract or increase our postage rates. So for example, in America, when people want to buy stuff for us, if they want to buy 1 issue of Beneficial Shock for £10, they're going to be paying about £16 on top of that for postage. Now, people do it, they will do it, but they're very clear of that process when they go through the website, and we can see exactly where that money comes in, and it's all accounted for when we post it out. We've got an ancillary shop on Instagram, which works really well, and that also works through Facebook as well. So we're able to connect these different dots, which means that there's lots of different ways that people can buy the magazine. And it also means that we can upload stories and various different things using social media, which we're doing. So another way of getting the magazine out there is to partner up. So we partnered up with Stack, and Stack took our magazine as well as Little White Lives and another illustrated film magazine called Shelf Heroes that's no longer around. And they bundle those things up. So things like that, and constantly sending the magazine to try and get some press reviews or people picking it up themselves. That's another way that increases our distribution. And also that way of just working directly through direct relationships with distributors rather than just through central. So that's what we're looking to avoid every single time. So not to have any magazines that are just piling up, at least they're out there somewhere. So the dissemination of magazines and the publication itself, at the moment, what we're doing is that we're primarily using Instagram because it suits perfectly with what our ambitions are for the magazine, because Instagram is primarily visual. So it works really well. So we've got lots of these different things that we have used, which connect to things like Instagram comics. So instead of just doing things in the magazine, we'll invite people that maybe we want to work with to do a comic for us, but we'll do it in small Instagram form. So that helps us to see how committed, or the style, or the ability that they've got to put together something like a comic. And then we can get that stuff out there. We've done things for Christmas where we've done the 12 days of Grinches, Grouches, and Movie Grumps. But all of these different things are just strategies that when you're producing a magazine, you've got to think about the name of what you're producing really getting into people's minds. And social media is something that I don't particularly love, but it's something that I know is really, really useful in terms of, continually doing things that are engaging our audience, whether it be in articles that we're doing interviews with various people, but it shows that we're not just doing a magazine, we're doing a lot more beside that. So the idea of doing various of these initiatives, which is not something that you'll see in the magazine, is just ways for people to see that what we do, what our philosophy is, and how we're branching that stuff out, and how we're getting engaged and involved in the illustration world and the film world. So these are just a few of the comics that people did. These are Instagram posts that we've got for interviews that we do with people. So this was Tony Stella, who's just done phenomenal work for film with posters and music design for various soundtracks for movies. So it's just this whole thing of considering that you need to be, or you should, if you're doing a publication, is just aim to be a little bit more than a magazine if you possibly can. So consider your purpose and look for ways to reinforce it through everything that you do. And also think about what can you provide your readers beyond a printed magazine. So that's the thing that we always think about. And what we do within Beneficial Shock, because we're both involved in education, it means that we can go to seminars and conferences. And that's a conference about illustration that Phil, who's there on the far left with the microphone, was involved. And he's involved a lot in the world of illustration and commissioning and getting students into jobs and thinking about working for agencies and the ins and outs of being an illustrator. So he's on forums for that, in the same way that I'm on forums for magazine production and art direction. We're involved with the Association of Illustrators, so we'll do initiatives with them now and then, because we always feel that when we've got illustrators in the magazine, we'll try to promote the stuff as much as we can, because we want to lift the work, and we want the work of the people that we have in the magazine to be noticed. And we also submit the work of our illustrators, writers, designers, typographers to various competitions. So a few of our illustrators are now in the archive of the William Klein archive, which was an award, or it's an award that happens every year, that supports avant-garde illustration. So again, we're constantly trying to not just be a magazine that just says, hey, look, we're just doing this work around film and we're working with illustrators, but we're also trying to lift up and engage with all the dialogue around illustration and art direction, which again goes all the way back to the initial questions that I was highlighting about what is it that you want to achieve with this project that you're working on? What are your ambitions? And how do they tie into your career or your career aspirations? So just to sum up, consider digital content in the online world relies heavily on the nature of transience. So stuff is here 1 minute and gone the next. So you always have to stay visible with what you do. And social media enables you to do that if you use it really well. And online shops and all that other stuff that I've been talking about. If you have an idea to create something of your own, don't think about it, just do it. And I've always said that, whether it's to my students or taking that advice myself about projects. So whatever happens, you're going to learn from the experience, and you'll have created something that wouldn't have existed if it weren't for you. What I've learned from the process is, especially with Beneficial Shock, is don't assume too much, because there's always going to be things that surprise you. It's really important to do your research, because the more prepared you are with all those things that I spoke about early on for the project, the more you're able to deal with any of the problems that might come down the line. Don't underestimate the workload, because it's always a lot if you do a project from scratch yourself. You'll be spending a lot more hours doing it than you think. But hopefully, if you've got the passion for it and you're really driven for it, and this is something that you really want to do, whether it's for, having more things on your CV, which will help you with your work, which it always does, because it shows that you've got initiative to do things yourself and to organize teams and to set things up. So there are always transferable skills that you've got from doing something like this. Things take longer than you think. Expect the unexpected. I mean, COVID, who would have thought that was going to happen? And that changed the whole nature of, getting magazines out there. And we had to rethink our distribution method to survive, really. You need to develop a thick skin, because there's a lot of people out there when you're working in editorial and content, management, and trying to get material from people, is that they'll let you down. It's always worthwhile being honest with people about what you're doing and what you're achieving. If you can't afford to pay people for certain things, you've got to be upfront with that. If you're sending emails to people and saying that you're going to do something, do it. Because people will remember you, and that's the whole point. And that's why the last point about be generous is really important, because the independent magazine sector is all about generosity. Like I said at the beginning, everyone is trying to lift everyone up. So the more generous you can be, writing about people's stuff, liking people's Instagram posts, not just because you're liking them just to kind of get them on board, but because you generally are interested in their success. And the more you can be generous with your time and working with others, and maybe doing a talk, or speaking to students, or whatever it might be, that is a really big part of the process. So I'm hoping that has been useful. I know it's been quite long, so I appreciate your patience. If you want to follow Beneficial Shock, we're on Instagram at that handle. Our website, you can check out our stuff, and do feel free to email me if you've got questions about designing, or about setting up your own magazine, or anything that I've outlined in the talk that maybe you didn't understand or want a bit more clarification of. Please feel free to email me, and I'll do my best to respond. So that's it.
Thanks, Gabriel. We've got Mark back.
Yeah, hi. Never went away. Thank you very much, Gabriel. Really brilliant, really informative, and a real pleasure to hear the narrative and hear the story of Beneficial Shock.
Thank you, Mark.
We don't have a huge number of questions in the chat at this point. Folks, please do pop questions into the chat. Okay, there are some questions popping in now. So I'll just bring those up. Okay. So yeah, please do continue to post things up into the chat that you want Gabriel to answer. So the first question was from Abigail. Abigail's one of my second-year students. And I know full well that she's had to disappear to go and pick her kids up from school. But she asked a question quite early on in your presentation to say, do you feel print publication work has declined over the years, or is there still a great demand for editorial print design?
Yeah, well, it's declining. I think there's a leveling off, because as all the different media, the proliferation of digital means that print doesn't have the dominance that it once used to do. So there's always going to be a leveling off, but it's the same argument that everyone said, well, print was going to die. It hasn't died. It's just sharing the industry with lots of other platforms and different ways of working. I always believe that design is design. There's plenty of print opportunities out there, editorial print. I think it's all about intentionality. It's like, if you're really interested in doing it, I think as a designer, I would always say it's important not just to put all your eggs into one basket. And that's why, as an editorial designer, I continue to work in print because it's my passion, but I also work in digital. So I had to convert a lot of things that were print into things for iPad and PDFs and interactive PDFs. And this was like 10, 12 years ago. I wasn't really that interested in it, but it was very useful to understand that process, because now if you are designing for a magazine, and a print magazine, chances are you're going to have to do some stuff for digital as well. You're going to have to convert some of those things. The difference with independent editorial design and independent magazines is the tendency is there's a lot more focus on the print, because that's what the love is that you've got tons and tons of people, hundreds and thousands of people out there that want to devour print. But what those designers do is they don't just think about the bog standard format. So they're always thinking about the paper stock, or what is it that makes this thing valuable? Why is this in print when effectively it could be digital, and I can have it in digital formats? So while I think the industry is narrowed, and there probably is less opportunity for editorial design, I think the opportunities that are there, a lot of them are being created by the new design ethos that people have got to say, okay, why am I doing this in print? What is the value of it? So it's made it a lot more focused. But I think, yeah, I mean, going back to the point that if you want to get into editorial print design, do it, but also have in the back of your mind that you should also know how to work with digital, converting those things to digital.
That's a really lovely answer. I think if I could add to that as a part of that conversation, I was chatting to a printer friend of mine week before last, over Easter, and he was talking about the fact that there's a lot less disposable print coming in, but there's a lot more high quality short production run.
Yeah.
So exactly, mirroring exactly what you were saying about the quality of production, the materials, the stock, the bindings, the way that people are exploring the physicality. It's not just the cheap, trashy sort of late 90s, let's have a million magazines all on the same glossy stock. It's a much more bespoke and a more enjoyable process, I think.
Yeah, and I think to add to that as well, the teams that you've got who work in editorial design, it is quite tough to get in there. And that's why when I'm encouraging people, if they are interested in doing it, is to set something up yourself, is that what you learn through the process is invaluable. But also, like I said before in one of those tips, is that it makes you employable in lots of different ways. If you set up your own thing, you become an author, and you realize that no one is doing what I want to be doing, and you can do it as a sideline, you can set up your own publication. It gets you working with printers, it gets you thinking about print materials, it gets you working with collaborators and other people. So everything that I've done, I think has enabled me to get work elsewhere, because I think people looked at not just the fact that I designed stuff or I produced things, but they also saw me as someone that could understand how to work as from an organizational structure. It showed a little bit more independence. It showed a little bit more maturity to be able to say, I'm not just a designer as a cog in a wheel. I actually understand the entire wheel. And that actually helps to be very employable in other sectors, so that you're not just, necessarily a Mac monkey who's just putting pages together for someone else. And that's why people like Matt Wiley, who's a great editorial designer, he runs his own magazine called Port, and he was working on Elephant, and he works with loads of other designers, and he works at Pentagram. But because he understands the structure, he understands the ins and outs of magazine production, he was employed to take on much bigger projects, not just to be a designer for projects.
That's really good. Thanks, Gabriel. A question from Dan G. Have you ever gotten to a point where all you do is editorial work, which ends up getting you kind of sick of it? And if so, what do you do to get your mind off of that?
Well, thanks for the question, Dan. No, I've not gotten to the point where all I'm doing is editorial design, because of all the projects that I've done, it takes me in different directions. My passion and the things that I love the most is editorial design. I've never been sick of it, because every project that I work on, or even the same issue that I'm working on for the next time, because I'm as interested in the content, because again, going back to that point, I'm not just working for the New Statesman, or I'm working for a scientific magazine or something, but the content's coming and I've got no real passion in the content or interest in the content. I do have a content in all the material I've ever done in the editorial sector, but I could kind of say I'm privileged, because in a way, all the editorial work I've done has been self-initiated. Even when I've taken editorial projects on for other people, they've asked me to think about the content, or the content has been something that I've been really passionate or interested in. So that's the thing that lends it. If I was in a different situation, I know loads of editorial designers that are doing lots of publication design and editorial design, newspaper design, which is a little bit repetitive. I don't know how they take their mind off it. They probably, go to the movies, or, go for a walk, or do other design work. So yeah, me personally, I've never gotten tired of editorial work, because I love it. Every page that I put together, or every new, opportunity of working with a paper stock or a different color or riso print or something, it's just a tactile experience that I love.
That's really cool. There are no other questions in the chat, so just to give people another minute or two, if anyone does think of any other questions. I just want to ask a couple of things myself. And Dan's just responded, cheers, Gabriel. So that's really
No
nice.
problem, Dan.
I was really sort of blown away actually by the three models that you got for commissioning the illustrators. There's something so unique and beautiful about that collaboration that you've set up. And that, you know, everything from very conventional to completely unconventional, illustrate something and then find a writer to work alongside it.
Yeah.
I think that's really interesting. I think the whole thing of designer as author, I mean, it's been discussed a lot. I don't know, people like Gert Dunbar and Adrian Shaughnessy and various other authors and designers have spoken about that. So for you as designer, writer, editor, which of those roles do you see yourself as predominantly, or is that one role, or is there a way of extricating those roles from each other? Do you have to sort of wear different hats in the process?
Yeah, definitely different hats, and sometimes it gets quite confusing. But because I was, when I was at university, in my second year, I set up a magazine which was called Bower House, because it was at Bower Ashton at the University of the West of England. And it was a magazine that was experimental. It was part of my second year module that I was working on, but I wanted to produce something that, because I knew lots of illustrators, I loved illustration, and I knew lots of writers and photographers. And I just wanted to do a project together with them, because I knew I wasn't a great writer. I wasn't a very good illustrator. And I wasn't a particularly good photographer, but I wanted to learn more about what they did. And by setting up the project, I did learn more, because I felt more of a vested interest in what they were doing. So I could talk to them and I could look at their writing and we could discuss things and I would put it together. But I think for me, I have always seen myself more as a project facilitator, and design and writing and editing are just parts of the bigger umbrella. So it's I guess the idea of having some sort of vision. I would never say that I'm just solely a designer, because I don't think design in and of itself appeals to me entirely to say that's what I want to be. I think I'm a little bit more, I have other interests that mean I want to bring them all together. And the only way that I found to do that is to project facilitate, is to have a concept or an idea, collaborate with other people and bring people in with what I was doing. I think whenever I've been in a situation where I was a designer working on my own for a client, I always felt a little bit adrift. I always wanted to have some voice in it. I always wanted to be working with other people. It's not to say that designers don't work collaboratively, because they do all the time. But I think for me personally, my journey, if I look over the last 20 years since I've graduated, is projects facilitation is the thing that interests me the most. And if I can add my skills of design and writing, because I very rarely write, although I do write in Beneficial Shock, and I write quite a bit for the other film magazine that I run, which is an online magazine, but that's predominantly me just feeling like it's a hobby, that I like doing it. And because it is a magazine that I'm publishing and I feel I'm good enough to put the stuff in there, I will put it in there. But if there's tons of other writing that I just think I'm going to pale into comparison, it's going to make me look like an idiot, I probably won't put it in there. But I think I've learned enough by the people that I've been working with, especially with writing, that I always, and I think this is what I was talking about generosity before, is ask questions, speak to people, get their insights, never feel that you've got the answers, because asking questions shows your willingness to learn and to realize that you don't know it all. And we don't know it all. I don't know it all. None of us do. So if you can get involved in the process, anything that you're interested in, and I think, you know, in this modern world, I mean, with technology and social media, where you can be accessible and other people can be accessible to you, get in contact with your heroes, get in contact with people, because they've probably got an Instagram, you know, handle, or they've got a Twitter account or something. It's much easier now to get in contact with people. If you write a really lovely email or text or whatever it is, chances are people will at least get back to you, even if they're going to tell you to fuck off. Well, no, that's not the case. But, you know, people if you're generous, if you're kind, if you're kind of saying why you're interested in what they're doing, there's nothing stopping you learning a huge amount from other people.
That's really great advice. That's really nice. Lastly then, other than saying thank you very, very much for giving up your time this afternoon, what's next for you and for Beneficial Shock?
Well, I think I mentioned before with Beneficial Shock, we're doing a little bit more on the website. So we want to engage a little bit more with doing interviews and talks. And we're quite interested in this idea of illustration and commissioning, the commissioning process. So we're hopefully going to work a little bit more with illustration organizations to see how we can collaborate outside of Beneficial Shock with talking about these new different models. So the things that we were doing with the the Institute of Illustrations or illustrators, and also with editorial designers, is that we want to be, rather than just a magazine that sits there and just produces stuff, we want to get involved in symposiums, conferences, things that we organize where people can learn a lot more. In the context of this type of talk, it's one thing, but in a slightly larger context where you've got lots of contributors, people coming in from illustration, people coming in from design, people coming in from magazines, to have something that looks at the way that we can work a bit more independently, and that this system that we've got, this commissioning process, can actually be a bit more embedded. So that's the next ambition for Beneficial Shock. But for me, I'm working on a book about movie locations in Los Angeles, which is coming out next year. So I'm working with two people, one in the States and one in the south of France. And this is a continuum from a book that I did about 10 years ago when I was working on this series of film locations. And then, yeah, we're working with student writers for film through universities and organizations, through my other web magazine, film magazine called The Big Picture. Because again, I'm just that relationship between education and what I do, I think, is inseparable. So everything that I want to be doing is less about just doing things for profit. It's more about, as part of education, how can we take students that are writing about film and give them more platforms to produce their work, but also for us to have platforms in the same way with Beneficial Shock, where we're talking about how to get into the industry. So tips and hints and methods and opportunities, and partnering up with film organizations and other film magazines. So yeah, becoming a bit more of an enabler, hopefully, with these projects.
That is absolutely wonderful. Gabriel, thank you ever so much. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for this ArtsFest talk. Claire, is there anything else that you want to say to wrap up?
Just to, I echo what you've just said, really, with a massive thank you, Gabriel. It's absolute gold to hear how a magazine functions from beginning to end. I personally have no idea anyway, so that, it's incredible. So yes, just a huge thank you, and thanks everyone for joining us. This talk will be available on our YouTube channel over the coming days. So if there's some information you want to revisit, then certainly come back in a few days' time, and it will be up there for you to view again. So thanks, Mark, for fielding all the questions, and have a great day. Thanks.
Thank
you very much.
See you again, Gabriel.
Bye-bye.
Bye now.